Hi guys, I'm starting the commentary track early on this video because I still haven't decided what to do for audio in the intro segment, but I did see your comments from the last video and I just want you to know I'm doing my part to protect your speakers and your eardrums. And here we are, another video in the editorial style. It won't be a super long one this time, but I think it might be useful to some of you in some way. Today we're talking about the different dynamics between melee versus ranged in Guild Wars 2 PvE content. Nothing against the PvP, folks. I'll be headfirst into the PvP myself at some point, but the melee versus ranged discussion in PvE was another one of those hot topics coming out of the first beta weekend event, and I've just been looking around a bit to see what has come out of that whole discussion. It seems some folks have adapted, and some, honestly, have largely decided just to forgo melee altogether as a viable playstyle for themselves, and I think that's a shame. So I've got some footage here of an encounter that may be familiar to some of you who have already participated in a beta weekend or two up to this point. We're going to go over that in a little bit of detail. I'm going to share some of my early impressions with you, as well as how those may or may not have changed. And I've also got some tips and ideas for you to take into your next experience with Guild Wars 2 that may or may not make the transition and the learning curve a little smoother. Before I jump into the example footage, I just want to point out one thing. It seems largely accepted by the Guild Wars 2 community at this time that melee has higher damage potential than ranged. I don't have any numbers or parses or anything of the sort to back that up, but all I can tell you is that anytime someone points out that melee tends to do more damage than ranged, it's extremely rare for someone to disagree. The reason I point that out is because you'll be able to see the damage I'm doing in both example segments, but in this case there's no accurate comparison to be made because I'm level 13 in the melee segment and my effective level is 15 in the ranged segment, which not only means increased base stats, but I also had a full set of level 15 armor increasing my stats as well. There are too many variables to do a proper damage comparison, so I'm just not even going to touch it. Now this guy here will be familiar to a lot of people who spent time in the Norn Starter Zone. This is the highest level event mob in the zone and was one of the more commonly referenced mobs when people were expressing their concern over melee combat dynamics. Before anyone asks, this footage was taken from the first beta weekend event, so if you're wondering why my UI looks different, it's because that's how it looked during that phase of the testing. When I took this footage, I had a few things working against me. First, I was quite new to the game and its dynamics. There are a lot of MMOs on the market where you more or less select a playstyle for yourself, and at least in terms of open world content, there are very few situations where it's necessary to deviate from that playstyle. ArenaNet's decision to do away with designated tanks and healers brings with it all new combat dynamics, and there's a learning curve associated with that. Also, I'm level 13 doing a level 15 event involving a level 17 champion mob. By the time I started recording this footage, I had already been clobbered a couple of times, so I'm a little bit gun shy about charging back in. At this point, I hadn't even equipped a ranged weapon on my character. And lastly, if you watch the boss mob, you can see there are times when he's on fire, and times when he's changing colors because he's poisoned, and the particle effects on the target can be a bit distracting. So after running around reviving players and NPCs and trying to observe and decide how best to approach, I just so happened to choose the absolute worst possible time to charge back in. One of the benefits to recording footage like this is you can go back and review what really happened, and quite often a person will find that what they notice when they're playing the game and what they notice when they're reviewing the footage is very different, especially when they're just learning. Now this here is the same encounter, only this time I'm 2 levels higher and I'm using a rifle. I'll let this footage play while I point out a few things. In that last segment, you saw what was at the heart of a lot of the concerns about the melee dynamic, and that was getting one shot with what often seems like very little warning. I've actually used this footage to time out how much warning you get from the time the boss starts to rear up to signal he's about to do something nasty, and the time he does his short-range AoE smash, and it's about 1 second. So you go from this melee perspective where everything is in your face and there are all kinds of things going on around you and the margin for error is often very low, to this sort of ranged environment where you practically have to intentionally do things poorly in order to even get hit. One very important point is that it's very difficult to judge combat mechanics based on what you encounter in the first 15 levels of an MMO with a level cap of 80. We know there are encounters in the game already that favor melee, and we know there are all kinds of mechanics in place that can make life for ranged attackers just as dangerous as it often is for melee. I'll be absolutely honest with you. Coming out of the first beta weekend event, my personal feeling was that melee combat in PvE was maybe a little too unforgiving, that the warning given out was often not enough, the damage output from the things you sometimes end up fighting was too aggressive, and I've since come to see things from a different point of view, and now I really enjoy it. And that was probably the biggest thing I took away from the first beta event, is that this game has enough things about it that are different from the previous mainstream status quo, that it's a tremendous benefit to approach it with an open mind and be willing to adapt. So based on my experience during and since the first beta weekend event, here are a few things I've discovered that can make things much more enjoyable and a little easier to adjust to. First, try to be ready for anything. That means that when you're exploring a new area and aren't sure what to expect, having both melee and ranged options at your disposal can make life a lot easier. What I found is that even if I chose the melee route, just knowing I could swap to a ranged weapon if I felt the need made my gameplay experience a lot less stressful. Second, when in doubt, start the encounter from range and observe. Watch for telegraph animations. Those are the monster animations that indicate they're about to do something potentially deadly. That teaches you what to watch for. You also want to watch the effects of their attacks. Are they sending out a cone of nastiness in front of them, or a ring of evil around them? Once you know where the dangerous spots are, then you know how to respond when the mob signals it's about to unleash hell. Third, when switching from range to melee, if you've identified that the mob is using AoE, try to time it so that you close the gap right after the mob uses its AoE attack. That way you've got a reasonable assurance that you'll be able to get some time on target to do some damage with your melee abilities before you have to dodge out or switch back to ranged for a while. Fourth, like I said, try to keep an open mind. The build you adopt in the early game is not the build you will be forced to use forever. As you progress your character and gain access to more trait points to invest, you can better tailor your character to match your preferred style of play. Do the best you can with what you've got and keep an eye on the horizon for what you might be able to do in the future. I would say that up to this point in the beta, none of us are really in a position to comment what the later areas of the game will be like in terms of how PvE combat dynamics will work out. So find a style you enjoy and don't be afraid to try new things from time to time. Lastly, and this might seem like a totally random point to make, but don't overlook underwater combat. Every starter zone has at least a small area where you can dive in, train up some weapon skills, and get a feel for that dynamic on your own terms. Better to start learning at a time and place of your choosing than to suddenly find yourself in a dungeon or a puzzle or some other situation where you need to perform only to find that you've never used an underwater weapon before. As simple as it sounds, just keeping those few points in mind took me from having serious concerns about the tuning of the game to actually feeling pretty good about it and looking forward to more. The more options you allow yourself, the more enjoyable the process. This definitely feels like one of those things where we bring our expectations and experiences from other games into Guild Wars 2, and then when they don't quite fit, we're not sure what to do with ourselves. A little patience and a willingness to look at things from a slightly different angle is often all it takes. And that's it. I have got a lot in the works right now with regards to my channel and some of the things I want to bring to my Guild Wars 2 content, so if you like what you see and haven't already done so, the best way to know when I upload a new video is to subscribe to my channel. I actually had a whole other editorial video almost finished and realized in the final moments that it was, well, crap. So while my goal is to get at least one video out per week to you guys, I'd honestly rather leave you hanging for a little while if I have to, and upload something that I'm happy with than to upload garbage for the sake of meeting some arbitrarily imposed deadline. Rest assured I am working hard to bring you guys the best content I know how, and it's only going to get more interesting from here. So I'll talk to you again soon, and in the meantime, take care and thanks for watching.